Okay, well, welcome to today's podcast from DGauge, and I'm joined today by my long-term friend and colleague Andrew McNaughton, who is currently chairman of Network Rail High Speed Limited, and who was previously the technical and strategy director for HS2. He's also been chief engineer of Network Rail and chairman of the World High Speed Rail Committee. So, Andrew, thanks for being part of our series of podcasts.
Good to be here.
Now, over a number of our podcasts, we've reflected on the role to play that rail has to play in the net carbon or net zero carbon agenda, where focus has been mainly on rail being amongst the low hanging fruit when it comes to its ability to turn green energy directly into traction. And essentially the message that rail can be very environmentally friendly. But in talking to you, what I'd like to uncover a bit about the thoughts of High Speed 2 as being portrayed as the bad boy, an axis of evil that will consume vast amounts of energy, taking Londoners to Birmingham faster than they want to go. So it would be a really good idea to hear your views. And I've got a number of questions for you. So I'll start with the first one, which is that it's billed as High Speed 2, but I don't think I've ever heard you talk about speed as being its primary attribute. Can you say a few words about what you consider to be the primary purpose of HS2?
Yeah. Speed is part of it, but it's part of it, if you see what I mean. There are basically four attributes of a new high-speed rail network. One is about speed, because it's about connecting people closer together, connecting cities closer together, businesses closer together, human beings closer together. That means reducing journey time. It's about capacity to do that. A horrible technical word. Basically, it's such an attractive form of travel that you want lots of people. It's like a jumbo jet, not a Concorde. I know it's been portrayed rather foolishly in that respect. It is a mass transport carrier with phenomenal capacity. The third is that world over, it's a new system, it's designed for the 21st century, it's absolutely reliable. So people can depend on it, and it's a big part of its attractiveness. And the fourth is, again, because it's built new, it's built for today's changing climate. So it's resilient. It doesn't fall over season in, season out, and it will be resistant to the climate changes of the next few decades.
Okay, so if we talk about climate, but moving on to perhaps the political climate, and as you know, that the latest buzzword is zero carbon, and we've also got this thing about levelling up the north-south economy. Do you think that's going to change people's perception of HS2?
When it's built and when it's open, as with High Speed 1, which was portrayed as a desperate thing through Kent until it opened, until it changed the whole economy of Kent, and it changed the failing towns of East Kent into prosperous places where people could go easily to other places for well-paid jobs, where people could come and settle in a much nicer environment and go to their work and bring that money back into the local economy, where tourists suddenly appeared because it was close enough to the rest of the country that you could actually get to it in a day. And all the businesses that came out of that, whether it would be builders of houses, house extensions, whether it be entertainment centres, whether it be coffee shops and restaurants. East Kent has transformed by High Speed 1. The same will be absolutely true when High Speed 2 is open. High Speed 2 just brings cities and people close together. Now, you mentioned zero carbon. I think there's three parts to this to think about. The first is, in operation, directly using zero carbon or renewables energy, its carbon footprint is basically nil. High Speed 1 is already in that situation, uses renewable energy, it is zero carbon. Now, it doesn't use a huge amount of energy per person who uses it. The International Railway Union has shown that you will get each person who travels, even from London to Birmingham, will be doing so on the equivalent of about 1 litre of petrol. It is low energy. It's lower energy than conventional rail, because basically you fill up a train and you run it to another place and then you come to a stop. Now, that's operational energy. Of course, to build it takes construction carbon. There's no two ways about that. But any capacity will use construction carbon. If you built new motorways, it'd be construction carbon. So the only way of avoiding that is to not to build anything at all and everybody stay at home, which of course is an option in some people's minds, but it doesn't kind of go with a society which is joined up, both economically and socially. The third is what I call manufacturing carbon and maintenance carbon, or committed carbon, as some people call it. Well, it's designed from scratch to be very low maintenance, so it can work day in, day out, 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. Maintenance work on it is very restricted, very limited, even compared with a conventional railway. So the maintenance carbon footprint is lower than an existing railway and lower than any other form of transport. And in terms of manufacturing, the assets, even the trains, last 20, 30 years, much longer than most of the transport forms. And I was reflecting the other day that a few months ago, I bought an electric car. The amount, and yes, it doesn't use a lot of carbon around town, but there's probably more carbon in its manufacturer, both the car and its batteries, than I would ever have committed by continuing to use my 20-year-old Volvo. And, you know, so the longevity of the assets matters in this equation as well.
Okay, that's a very interesting point, and I think certainly the issue of electric cars as well is clearly something that people have put a lot of faith in without really thinking about the carbon footprint of the vehicle themselves.
Well, there's two things about that, David, and sorry to just come back on it.
That's all right.
Before we move on. However autonomous and however electric cars are, and however much you accept using up the world's resources of non-renewable metals in producing batteries, the fact remains you can only get so many cars on the network.
Yeah.
It's called capacity.
Yeah.
If you remember, the capacity of a motorway is about 6,000 people an hour, and the capacity of one high-speed railway is about 3 times that. It just goes back to, why would you not in the 21st century use a zero carbon, highly efficient, highly attractive and totally dependable transport system? You know, it's like saying, why don't we still use stone for everything? Well, we left the Stone Age, we didn't run out of stone, we found something better. And across the world, we discovered that high-speed rail is a better way of getting large numbers of people between major centres of population than any other means of transport.
Okay, well, if we look at that and take it forward into the journey experience, and looking particularly at, for example, you know, you get in your car outside your house and you end up at your destination with your luggage, and effectively you've been cocooned over that whole journey. One question I was going to ask you was about going from the phase 1 part of HS2 onto the rest of the journey, and particularly, you know, if you're going to go as far as Birmingham on the first stage, then, you know, you're going to have to do something to extend that journey to other parts of the country. And my question really is gauge related, because, as you know, I've got a little bit of an interest in gauging, and this was about the choice between having a train that was purpose-built, designed for the high-speed bit of the network, which could and presumably will be built to European standards, rather than building it to Stephenson's original rolling stock gauge. But that by having a train that goes beyond Birmingham, just to give journey continuity, is compromising on the actual size of the train. And I wonder, you know, what was the economics that basically said it's worth us actually compromising the size of the train in the first instance, rather than saying we're going to break the journey at Birmingham and people can move on to the platform next door, very much as one would do, say, in Japan, where, you know, the timing of trains from one platform to the adjacent one means that your seat is reserved no more than 10 yards walk away from where you get off the last train. So I just wondered if you could say a bit about what your thinking was in terms of, why a train that will go beyond Birmingham in the first instance, but which will be compromised in design as a result.
At this point, David, I probably depart from the official script a little bit, which goes something like this. You're completely not surprised by that. You wouldn't have asked the question otherwise. In my ideal world, the Japanese approach would have been the best approach for Britain, which is to build to some serious hubs and have sufficiently dependable connecting transport that people could have guaranteed connections. And you can call that Japanese, but frankly, go to Switzerland, where connections are guaranteed within a couple of minutes because the whole system works efficiently. That, frankly, at this stage of the development in this country is a step too far, unfortunately. So it is a compromise. It's the bit that says there is no point having a super efficient, very quick trunk if you can't rely on the connection for that trunk part of the journey. So what we've got is that compromise, which is, look, and the other thing was we're going to build it in stages. And if you take, again, just take High Speed 1 as an example. Eurostar is built to British gauge. The original Eurostar trains built to British gauge because they first of all came across the channel and had to travel on the southern region. Yeah. Then after phase 1, they came across the channel, travelled on HS1 for 40 miles, and then went on the southern region. Now, the second generation of trains bought by the Eurostar organisation are standard European trains because they come through to St Pancras on what you can call European gauge all the way. Well, the same is going to be true of HS2. Trains to Manchester on day 1, so that Manchester gets a huge amount of benefit out of the first stage. All the trains will be British gauge, British conventional gauge, so that people can travel between cities without change or interruption. Phase 2, when HS2 gets to Manchester, then you can buy a fleet of trains that go all the way with all the extra space and scope for a much nicer journey from a bigger cross-section train. And that's where you see the benefit. So we're building now, future generations will see the benefit of that building.
Okay.
And, long after we've gone, people will get the benefit out of HS2 from what the decisions we made today.
Okay. That's a good answer. Thank you. I mean, I'd certainly, I'd want, I mean, clearly I'm quite keen that you should have a fleet of trains that needs to be threaded through the existing network, because that probably preserves my my career for as long as I need.
Yeah, you're not going to be out of a job in the short term.
No, I don't think so. Going back to your bit about electric cars, Boris Johnson, who I have to hasten to add is no relation to me as far as I know, announced a ban on diesel engine cars from 2040, and it was then brought forward to 2035. And the Financial Times, I think it was a couple of days ago, reported that it's now going to be brought back to 2030 to jumpstart the electric car market. Now, aside from the issues of will we have charging networks and will we have a national grid that can accommodate this, do you think that this move towards getting rid of diesel engine cars, petrol engine cars and that sort of thing is going to evoke some sort of shift of passengers to rail? And if it does, do you think it could cope both in terms of the capacity and the end-to-end journey experience? I mean, you've probably answered the end-to-end journey experience bit, but do you think the capacity could cope if we suddenly find that we've got to replace all our 30-year-old Volvos?
I think this is really very complex, David. In terms of travel between cities, longer distance travel, it's a bit that says the technologists will say, of course, you can build cars that will do 300 miles between charges. Tesla already do. But they're massive things.
Mm.
And is that actually a really great use of the finite resources and capacity of batteries? I don't think the people who spout this stuff have actually understood the scale of it. And it's one thing, and I do think there is a huge future for electric cars on journeys of 20, 30 miles. And I do think those of us in rail transport have got to think far more about out-of-town hubs where people can either bring their cars, leave them charging during the day, then come back to them at the end of the day. Because I'm sure you're right, the cost of charging infrastructure is going to be phenomenal and hardly carbon neutral either. So, and how far this takes people down the path of shared vehicles, movement, mobility as a service, rather than owning their own cars. I don't know many young people who see car ownership as a great status symbol, is something we old people, we from the 60s and 70s and 80s think of as a desirable thing. Most young urban people can't even be bothered to get a driving license. It's called an Uber. So electric Uber, absolutely fine. Clean air in cities is probably more important to many people than the carbon story. I remember that battery cars are on average half a ton heavier than ordinary cars. And that means more particulates from tyres. I found a statistic about how many tyres are abandoned, dumped each year in this country, about 30 million. And think of all the carbon that goes into those tyres, but think of the we're basically building a country on disused rubber tyres. It's awful. So anyway, coming back to this, long distance, why would you use an electric car long distance if you've got a more attractive form of transport? The key for us is to design a door-to-door, sufficiently attractive form of transport that people go, I can't be bothered with all that stuff. And I'll charge my car at home and I'll use it for 20-mile journeys. Of course, remembering that half the population has not got access to driveways.
Yeah.
So where's all that coming from? So I'm just a simple soul on this. I don't get it. I do get how simple it is to electrify a railway and carry huge numbers of people.
Okay, that's fairly clear. Thank you.
Sorry, a bit of a muse that. It's quite a difficult question.
I think. Well, you know me. I like to have a little bit of something in the questions I'm asking. You can tell that I have.
Can I say just one other thing on it? There?
Yeah.
That's passenger transport.
Yeah.
What really fascinates me is what is the future of long distance logistics, freight transport.
What is
the reasonable replacement for a highly efficient diesel powered lorry?
Yeah.
People have said, oh, we'll put electric wires above the carriageways. I think that's called a train because you could join the lorries up.
Yeah.
So if we talk about rail freight, I think rail freight has got a fabulous future if we think about it differently, because I cannot see an efficient solution to logistics if diesel lorries become pariahs.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask you a question about freight because clearly, I mean, freight is changing. The number of white vans, for example, as a result of Amazon, often portrayed as being the sort of another axis of evil, and that Amazon, of course, is the death of the high street. But of course, people do choose to use Amazon, and that's possibly one of the reasons why it seems to work so well. Going back to this freight business, though, I seem to remember that one of the issues with HS1, or as it was known at the time, Channel Tunnel Rail Link, was about that in order to get the funding for it, that it had to demonstrate it could carry freight as well. And the issue, of course, of designing trains to nice light axle loads and minimizing dynamic forces, which allows you to have a much better maintenance regime, seemed to be lost on people that said, no, we've got to carry heavy freight on it as well. And my concern is that HS2 might suffer the same fate. And I wonder whether you feel that the pressures will be on HS2 to be hauling, dare I say, diesel freight trains under it, but any sort of freight. And what is the future of freight in terms of high speed, and particularly in relation to, so we say, white van now?
If you think of conventional freight, I'll leave out heavy haul, because that, apart from construction materials, what is heavy haul in the future? If you're not carting around diesel fuel, you're not carting around coal. So when we talk about freight today, we tend to talk about containerized freight. And actually, the conventional network, the existing network, has the capacity to take freight trains where they want to go to, which is called freight terminals. Whereas, unsurprisingly, a high-speed passenger railway goes to passenger terminals. Now, leaving that trite comment one side, I think there's an opportunity, and I've been writing about this in a couple of countries, which is, just as the French have had TGV postal, in other words, carrying letters across France overnight at speed, or even not overnight, in the evening or in the early morning. You're right about the rise of packet and parcel traffic. And there is something to be considered about, just as aircraft have belly freight, why can't there be, in inverted commas, freight high-speed trains that carry packets? And just as in aircraft you have palletized, I call it palletized freight, what is to stop high-speed rail having palletized freight? Optimized, with pallets optimized to the size of the insides of a trains. I think this is a topic that certainly I want to be looking into in the next year or so, quite seriously, because that's a way of bringing parcels and packets and fresh goods right into the centre of cities. Some people have said, well, of course, because there may be less business travel between cities in the future, with people using the likes of Zoom more, and perhaps a bit less commuting, there'll be more space on the network for freight. It doesn't have to be just container freight, although there'll be few things more popular, I think, with much of the population than getting container lorries off the road and onto rail, and I agree. But I think there's another opportunity here, which is in combination with the likes of those companies you just talked about, the distribution companies, to bring palletized freight into cities and depots on the edge of cities, where they can be shipped easily into and broken down easily into the sorts of loads that an electric white van can deliver. And I've always thought for some years that the easiest form of easiest form of transport that you could electrify quickly is white van. Because what do? They go to a depot. They can get recharged at a depot. The charging infrastructure is there. And it would make a difference, because it would reduce the emissions inside cities where it's most important. So a combination of electric freight, possibly even high speed, and electric local distribution, electric white vans, strikes me as a winning combination if we can just get our head around it.
Okay. You mentioned France there, and Pastel. In France, I think one of the things that it's done has been to decimate the market for internal flights. In that now it seems that the majority of travel between, well, it started off as Paris-Lyon, of course, but it's further than that now, is by TGV. Do you think that as we get more and more high-speed rail around the world, that we could possibly see the demise of this low-cost air travel and low-cost airlines?
I think that's probably, I can see a diminution of it, not an high-speed rail. I think you can reasonably say it should be competitive up to 800 kilometers, or so 500 miles, which, considering how small Europe is quite a big difference. Particularly if it's somewhere as dense as Europe, where you've got big enough traffic flows. I have to remind people when often when there's a debate about why won't there be through trains from, say, Birmingham to Marseille, is how many people actually travel. You can put everybody who travels between Paris and Birmingham pre-pandemic by plane every day into half a high-speed train. The reality is that a lot of these very long distances where there's actually penny numbers of people travelling, and therefore actually a plane with 100 seats on it, it's not a bad way of carrying 100 people, not a 1,000-seat passenger train with 900 empty seats. Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? The capacity is better used for other things. In terms of holiday flight, and we can really kind of say to people, oh, most low-cost travel is for leisure and holiday. Oh, you're not going to do leisure and holiday anymore. That's not going to happen. I think the low-cost airline market will thrive, but thrive differently. High-speed rail can take the load between cities and city regions. And low-cost airlines will be more about holiday destinations that actually is really difficult to justify ever building a railway to.
Okay. I'd like to perhaps wrap up with one more question, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
And we've heard a lot about the levelling up of the north-south and the agenda for that. And tying it in with that last one, that for me, living in the shall we say, third world part of the UK known as Somerset, that for me to travel to, for example, Paris means that usually the most cost-effective way or the most convenient way is for me to just get on a flight from Bristol to Paris direct. If I lived in London, then that would be a different matter altogether. I would have no hesitation about just getting on a Eurostar and doing that. But we see this north-south divide thing brought up. At what point do you think someone's going to look and see the south and the southwest leveled up? Because I think that if you actually start to look to the south of London, it's not quite as rosy as people might think it is.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. You've heard me talk at length that in the past, the key metric in bringing cities together, bringing people together, is an hour. And when you bring cities within an hour of each other and people within an hour of each other, you get economic effects, agglomeration, but also you get social mobility. It's what we've seen with High Speed 1 again. We're bringing the coast of Kent, Ashford, and places well within an hour of London, Canterbury within an hour of London. High Speed 2 will bring cities across, on the north-south spine within an hour of each other. What are we saying? Manchester to Birmingham in 3/4 of an hour, Leeds to Birmingham an hour, Newcastle to Nottingham an hour. It really is the game changer. I know it's a terribly overused word. When you turn the compass to Bristol and Exeter, but to cities that you think are prosperous like Portsmouth and Southampton, they're not prosperous. They're actually not prosperous. But Southampton is an hour and a half from London. It's only 80 damn miles. Yeah, that is not. Yeah, Southampton will be further away from London than Manchester or Leeds. Extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, you don't have to say, oh, we need high-speed rail all the way and get to Southampton in sort of 3 minutes, 47 seconds. But you need to bring these places within an hour. And for me, that means a mixture of some new build, which gives you capacity, and some upgrade. You don't have to build all the way to Bristol, but you'd have to do something a bit better than we got.
Yeah.
Sorry, And again, sorry, just to finish that, the French have done the same thing. After you think the Paris out towards Bordeaux and Brittany for many years was a high-speed line for the first 100 miles to Tours, about 100 miles. And that brought places close enough to get a real economic impact. Now, okay, traffic is then built up to the point where it's been worthwhile building some more. But you don't have to do it all at once. There is something about a new line, and that's something else we could talk about in much greater detail, a new line that heads south and west out of London that has the ability to, probably via Heathrow to be honest, that has the ability to bring the major cities of the south and west similarly within the economic sphere of this country. That is unfinished business.
It's also exciting.
Yeah.
Let's hope that we can at least see the start of that in our lifetimes.
Well, we should do the thinking.
Yeah.
Other than, future generations will benefit, but at least, let's, just like people in the 1930s thought about the motorway network, they weren't around when it was built.
Yeah.
We've got, just like our forefathers, to think the future of this country, not what it needs today, but what it will need in the next 100 to 150 years, because this is 150-year infrastructure.
Yeah. That's great. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been a really interesting conversation, Andrew. Thoroughly enjoyed the chat as ever. And I look forward to talking with you again, maybe in person at some point. Let's hope. But in the meantime,
It's a pleasure, David.
Thank you very much. And I hope anyone watching this has enjoyed it. As ever, we appreciate any comments on the LinkedIn page to say what you think. So thank you very much and cheerio.